A dangerous virus is spreading rapidly in China, and U.S. officials are very worried that it could come here. China has more than 200 confirmed cases of coronavirus, it's called, which produces pneumonia-like symptoms. 3 people have already died from this illness, which has spread to at least 3 other Asian countries.
Now to growing concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S. Here's what we know. A Washington state resident fell ill after returning from Wuhan, China, where the outbreak began. Officials now say more than 400 people have been sickened and 9 people have died.
The U.S. Embassy in China is evacuating American citizens from Wuhan, the center of the coronavirus outbreak. More than 1,500 cases are now reported in China, where at least 54 people have died. Here in the U.S., 63 patients have been tested in 22 states. Here's Remy Inocencio.
At Ground Zero in Wuhan, an army of excavators is in a frantic race to now build not 1, but 2 hospitals to treat over 2,000 people infected with the coronavirus. As patients continue to pack into hospitals, medical supplies are running low: masks, gloves, and surgical gowns. The city's highways, train station, and airport now sit empty after officials restricted access out of the sprawling city of 11 million people. More than a dozen surrounding cities and towns, an estimated 50 million people, are now on some kind of total or partial transport lockdown. Most of the infections have been in mainland China, but fresh cases are popping up. Today, Australia and Malaysia reported their first cases, and Japan reported a third. France confirmed 3 cases on Friday, while the U.S. identified a second in Chicago. Fears of infection have spread from Wuhan this past week. As our CBS News crew left before the city's lockdown, nearly every departing passenger at the airport was wearing a mask. And across the country, including Beijing, where we were checked for fevers right after we got off the plane.
3 people tied to universities and a hospital in the Boston area were indicted on charges that they lied about their ties to China. Prosecutors say that these separate cases point to the ongoing threat of Chinese espionage here in the U.S. Prosecutors say that the individuals attempted to steal research in order to bring it back to China. The first is a Harvard University professor, Dr. Charles Lieber. Prosecutors say he had a contract with a top Chinese university. He also ran a group which had contracts with the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health. Federal agents say Lieber lied about his ties to China when he bid on those contracts.
China is engaged in a massive, long-term campaign to steal U.S. research and technology for its own uses. As demonstrated by these cases, on the academic side, the Chinese government uses partnerships and exchanges with U.S. schools and research institutions to access cutting-edge research and equipment. Obviously, most visiting Chinese academics and researchers are here to work in good faith in U.S. institutions, but some of them are not.
No country poses a greater or more severe and long-term threat to our national security and economic prosperity than China. China's communist government's goal, simply put, is to replace the United States as the world's leading superpower, and they're breaking the law to get there. Massachusetts is a target-rich environment with world-class academic institutions, research facilities, hospitals, cleared defense contractors, and startups. And each and every one of them are in danger of having their research, development, and investments stolen right out from under them.
Harvard responded to Dr. Lieber's indictment, writing, "The charges brought by the U.S. government against Professor Lieber are extremely serious. Harvard is cooperating with federal authorities, including the National Institutes of Health, and is initiating its own review of the alleged misconduct. Professor Lieber has been placed on indefinite administrative leave." Also indicted is a Chinese national who was working as a researcher at Boston University. The U.S. attorney says that she's also a member of the Chinese military, but that she failed to disclose that. The third is a researcher sponsored by Harvard doing research at Beth Israel, who's accused of attempting to smuggle biological materials back to China. Officials say customs found 21 vials stuffed into a sock when he was trying to leave the country.
Coronaviruses are a type of virus that can spread from animals to humans and cause diseases like SARS and MERS. The latest coronavirus outbreak started in Wuhan, China. So far, it's killed almost 1,400 people and infected more than 60,000 around the world. Scientists are racing to figure out how humans contracted the new virus. Based on initial genetic testing and past outbreaks, they say it's likely the coronavirus originated in bats.
There was a recent paper put out where they looked at the sequence of a virus.
They found that the closest relative to the Wuhan virus was a virus from a bat, 96% similar.
I think that is pretty accepted, that the viruses are very likely coming from bats, but how they're getting to us from bats, either directly or through some intermediate host, needs to be worked out for this new one.
There isn't one particular kind or species of bats that's associated with spillovers. For Nipah and Hendra, it's the big fruit bats. For SARS and MERS and this one, it's smaller insect-eating bats.
Other animals have passed viruses between bats and humans before.
SARS really spread from civet cats into humans, but now we know that the virus at some point in time jumped from bats into civet cats.
With MERS, what we think happened there is that a coronavirus jumped from bats into dromedary camels, and recently we're seeing this virus jumping from dromedary camels into the human population.
Now, Chinese scientists say pangolins could be the middlemen, but their research hasn't been made public yet.
I think the isolation of this virus from pangolins is going to cause a lot of stir, because there is going to be kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, pangolins are probably it. The more that people look at some of the genetic data, you'll get a little bit of infighting in the scientific community as to really whether or not the pangolin virus is the true direct link, or if it's just maybe another piece of the puzzle.
I think we should be really cautious until we see the paper that comes out.
Scientists don't need to know where the virus came from in order to develop a vaccine, but identifying the origin can help contain the current outbreak and prevent future ones. Scientists do know that bats and rodents carry a relatively high number of viruses, but bats often don't get sick from them.
If we can figure out why bats don't get sick, we may be able to apply it to reducing the effects of viral infection. We don't have clear-cut answers. We've got a lot of hypotheses. One is that bats are the only mammals that have evolved the ability to fly. Flying takes up an enormous output of energy. As a byproduct of all that metabolic activity, you generate toxic molecules. What bats have done is evolve to deal with that. Those properties, for whatever reason, allow them to deal with viruses as well. But all this is conjecture.
We and other groups over the years have identified molecular mechanisms that bats have evolved that suppresses inflammation in bats. So bats have a good antiviral response that helps them control virus replication, and they have low levels of inflammation.
Worldwide this morning, growing concern over a growing health crisis, with health officials here in the U.S. moving fast to prepare for what the CDC has called an inevitable spread.
We are right now in a very active containment mode.
Thousands of Americans nationwide already under voluntary self-quarantine after returning from China, even though they don't pose any immediate risk. The U.S. has faced outbreaks before. From SARS in 2003, which killed at least 774 globally, to the H1N1 virus in 2009, which had an estimated global death toll of at least 151,000. Both outbreaks providing the government a roadmap as it navigates the days and months ahead. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, Dr. Benjamin Singer says they're on alert for coronavirus, even as the ER and ICU are filled with patients recovering from the seasonal flu. how do you distinguish between coronavirus and the typical flu?
It can be a challenge when a patient first presents for care because the symptoms overlap quite a bit. And that's why we pay a lot of attention to their history, where they've traveled, and the people with whom they've been in contact.
Meanwhile, as health screenings continue at select U.S. airports, the CDC is distributing new test kits to public health labs nationwide as early as next week, ensuring there are enough supplies on hand, including surgical masks and gowns. First responders now training to identify possible cases. In Pittsburgh, they've been given personal protection kits. Health experts, though, insist an outbreak will look nothing like what's been depicted in Hollywood movies.
When did we run out of body bags?
Like Contagion in 2011.
It will look and feel to the American people more like a severe flu season in terms of the interventions and approaches you see.
President Trump says he'll do whatever is necessary, even if that means following China's lead and quarantining entire cities.
We do have plans on a larger scale if we need it. We don't think we're going to need it, but, you always have to be prepared.
Prepared to take every precaution while facing a new and unfamiliar disease.
Look down. And Tom, even on the way down here, flying down here, a couple of people had those face masks on, so it got me wondering, and a lot of folks wondering, are they a good idea? Do they do anything?
Yeah, so I asked Dr. Singer here at Northwestern that very question, and he referred me to the CDC guidance, which says if you are sick or if somebody in your family is sick, then this makes a good idea, right? Because you want to avoid spreading the germs. It's less effective if you're simply trying to avoid getting sick by going through an airport or a bus station or whatever else. This may not be that helpful. What is helpful is to constantly wash your hands, don't touch your face, and if you're in a clinical environment, take advantage of the hand sanitizer. All of us here in the ER have been doing this constantly, both yesterday and today.
You mentioned the CDC, Tom. There's news this morning that they're changing their criteria for testing patients after that first case of unknown origin in the U.S. was confirmed. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and this is critical, right? Because up until now, they were separating these cases out simply by the travel history. But now, if this disease is spreading on its own in the United States, that no longer is enough. So they're now going to be pushing 93 test kits to labs across the country by this weekend so that there will be a quicker way to diagnose somebody with coronavirus. Meanwhile, 70 companies are competing with finding some sort of a diagnostic test for hospitals to use at the bedside so that you don't have to necessarily send those out to a lab. But absolutely, the whole spectrum here is opening up if this is now out among the population as opposed to a simple travel history alone.
The breaking news, stay at home. That is the order tonight from 4 state governors as the coronavirus pandemic spreads. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut all ordering non-essential employees to stay home. Those orders cover 75 million people across the United States. New York's governor today telling non-essential businesses in his state to reduce their workforce to 0.
These are not helpful hints. This is not if you really want to be a great citizen. These are legal provisions. They will be enforced. There will be a civil fine and mandatory closure for any business that is not in compliance. Again, your actions can affect my health. That's where we are.
But President Trump saying these orders will not go national.
Given what Governor Cuomo has done in New York, is there any more consideration to a national lockdown to keep people in their homes?
I don't think so. Essentially, you've done that in California. You've done that in New York. Those are really two hotbeds. Those are probably the two hottest of them all in terms of hotspots. I don't think so, because you go out to the Midwest, you go out to other locations, and they're watching it on television, but they don't have the same problems.
Fast-breaking developments in the coronavirus emergency in the U.S. and around the world. The number of cases soaring just today, more than 24,000 now nationwide. New Jersey today becoming the 6th state to close all non-essential businesses, joining California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. More than 80 million Americans now told to stay at home. New York State with more than 11,000 cases, and now New York City with new rules on who will be tested. Plus, Governor Andrew Cuomo's alarming prediction. He says 40 to 80% of people will ultimately become infected. Across the country, some hospitals bracing for the worst, beds filling up with patients, critical supplies in some cases running dangerously low, and healthcare workers afraid they will have no way to protect themselves. Vice President Pence saying he and his wife will both be tested after one of his staffers became infected with the virus. And as we come on the air, the FDA late today revealing a new rapid test will be available at the end of the month, giving results in hours instead of days. ABC's Diane Macedo leads us off.
Tonight, the so-called epicenter of the coronavirus crisis in the U.S. is making drastic changes to COVID-19 testing.
We have to keep focused on where the need is greatest, and that's how the testing programs will go.
The New York City Health Department is now limiting testing to hospitalized patients only in hopes of not only preserving tests for the most ill, but also preserving the protective equipment required for each test, equipment that protects healthcare workers and is in short supply. But Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease specialist, says not every American needs to get tested.
When you go in and get tested, you are consuming personal protective equipment, masks and gowns. Those are high priority for the healthcare workers who are taking care of people who have coronavirus disease.
Officials say the priority groups are those that are hospitalized, symptomatic healthcare workers, and seniors, especially those in long-term care facilities or those with pre-existing conditions. We spoke to a nurse in Buffalo, New York, who returned from a trip to Thailand with symptoms. She hasn't been able to get a test.
I think that I possibly could have the COVID-19 with the symptoms that I'm presented with. I am a registered nurse in the operating room, so it is concerning that, there's not tests available to test us before I do return to work.
Meanwhile, after news that a member of his staff was diagnosed, the vice president now says he and his wife tested negative.
Neither the president nor I had direct contact with that staff person. We worked immediately with the White House physician and the CDC.
The virus is impacting air travel, too, with the FAA issuing a brief ground stop at New York City and Philadelphia airports after an air traffic controller trainee tested positive for COVID-19. All stops are now lifted, but Americans are urged not to travel unless absolutely necessary.
Every American has a role to play in defending our nation from this invisible, horrible enemy. We say stay at home and save lives.
New Jersey is just the latest state to order residents to do their part. In total, more than 84 million Americans are now under state directives to stay home.
Any place people congregate is a place where coronavirus can be spread.
Here in New York, the president has also declared the state a major disaster area. FEMA will now bear 75% of the state's costs in fighting the outbreak.
I'm considering other areas where we may or may not be doing that, and I'm working very closely with Gavin Newsom, governor of California, and others.
With over 11,000 diagnosed with coronavirus, New York has nearly half the confirmed cases in the entire country. But the governor says New York is also conducting more tests than any other state. More than half of those cases are ages 18 to 49, showing the young are not immune. In the New York suburb of New Rochelle, now on its 10th day as a containment zone, the superintendent of schools reports she's now tested positive for the virus. Families there are grappling with a new reality as images show that reality spreading nationwide. In L.A., the iconic Grauman's Chinese Theater is no longer filled with tourists. Chicago's Millennium Park cleared out. And the usually bustling Las Vegas Strip is almost entirely deserted.
Some incredible images tonight. Diane Macedo joins us live from New York City. And Diane, I want to bring you in on this news from the FDA that so many anxious Americans will be glad to hear. The agency now approving a new rapid test for coronavirus.
Yeah, Tom, the FDA says this new test authorized today will produce results in hours rather than days. It's projected to be rolled out on March 30th. The agency says this will make testing much more easily accessible to Americans who need it. Tom?
Very promising news tonight. All right, Diane, thank you.
Because the reality is reassuring. It is deep breath time.
My administration has also taken the most aggressive action in modern history
to protect Americans from the coronavirus. You know about this whole thing. Horrible.
Former Vice President Joe Biden making a remarkable political comeback.
And we're told, well, when you got to Super Tuesday, it'd be over. Well, it may be over for the other guy.
We play games without the fans? Yeah. No, it's impossible. I ain't playing. I ain't got the fans in the crowd. That's what I play for.
Social distancing, and that's an aggressive measure that's taken to help contain an outbreak or slow its spread.
The Grand Princess crossing the iconic Golden Gate. 21 on board infected with coronavirus, most of them crew members.
It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. We want to protect our shipping industry, our cruise industry.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. I am officially declaring a national emergency. Two very big words.
Traía un taxi camino a casa, haber trabajado toda la noche. ¿Qué les puedo decir? Siguen llegando un montón de pacientes. El terror que a mí me da es que de un paciente el miércoles pasado a hoy, que son 6 días, tenemos ¿cuántos? 50 y tanto, ya casi 60, o algo así, una locura.
And that means we have to do testing. We have to get the testing kits up and ready. I would have the World Health Organization. I'd take advantage of the test kits they have available to us.
The Dow sank nearly 3,000 points, its worst day since 1987, and its second biggest single-day percentage loss in history.
School districts are starting to close throughout the United States for the rest of the year. And it's just crazy to think, as a teacher, like the last time I saw my kids last week could be the last time I see them all year.
It's been 5 days since I was tested. And I called the doctor again today. They said they don't have my test back. The doctor seemed really frustrated, or his nurse did. They said the lab's really backed up.
I am currently practicing social distancing. I'm on a little quarantine, if you will. Staying inside as much as possible, unless I have to go to the supermarket.
Candy here. Candy's full. Bread is not. Bread is not.
We're on our way to IHOP in Patterson, and before we even do that, we have our face mask and our gloves to make sure that we're safely picking up and distributing it to the people in need.
Yeah, my mother is not expendable, and your mother is not expendable. And we're not going to accept a premise that human life is disposable.
Yesterday, I had to FaceTime a family member so they can say goodbye to their mom, their aunt, their grandma. And I never thought that we would ever have to go through this without family members being beside them.
We had some intensive conversations with him, and we convinced him. He listened, and we said the better part of valor would be to extend them until the end of April.
We have just heard from President Trump at the White House with perhaps his most somber message yet, calling on Americans to brace for a, quote, very tough 2 weeks, saying that Americans should be prepared for more than 100,000 deaths before we get through this.
This set of nucleotides relates to the receptor binding domain, or RBD. That's the part that latches onto the receptors on targeted cells. As viruses can only survive when inside other cells, this is a vital section that you would have to focus on if you were to make a virus in a lab. Gary and his team found the RBD has evolved specifically to bind to the human cell ACE2, a receptor usually used to help regulate blood pressure. But it's the way it so successfully binds to the ACE2 receptor that is crucial. You see, when a scientist tests what aspects would make a virus more potent, they run models through computer simulations. But when researchers put this sequence through those simulations, they found that SARS-CoV-2's RBD shouldn't be successful at all, and would actually cause poor efficiency and transmission, which we know is not the case.
By working in the lab or working with the computer or trying to figure it out, they just would not have come up with this particular way to have this virus bind to its receptor, a very important part of the whole replication process.
In other words, if your goal was to make a virus to infect humans, you wouldn't have chosen this one.
Basically what nature has done is come up with a solution for binding that is better than any computer and ultimately better than what any scientist could come up with.
So we know why scientists confidently say SARS-CoV-2 wasn't made in a lab, but that's not the end of the story. It's also been rumored that SARS-CoV-2 was a known virus that was accidentally leaked from a lab. Now, we can't say for certain this isn't the case, but it's highly unlikely. For one, this virus wasn't sequenced before January 2020. And if it was, the world would know, because the Wuhan Institute of Virology was specifically looking for something like this in order to protect the world from any outbreaks.
They would have come up with a SARS coronavirus that was 76% similar to the original SARS-1. They would have published that as fast as they could. That would have been, at least in the scientific world, very big news.
But it's also just statistically highly unlikely.
So just out in nature, there are literally millions of people that are having millions of encounters with these animals. And, we're talking about a handful, a few dozen maybe, in the whole world of scientists that go out and trap that. So just on the odds of the things, it's just a minuscule chance that it was this one scientist that accidentally infected himself in this very sophisticated laboratory setting.
Do you want to respond to the allegations at all? No comment from Charles Lieber, a top scientist at a top university who today was in federal court for a case federal investigators say highlights China's attacks on U.S. schools.
China is engaged in a massive, long-term campaign to steal U.S. research and technology for its own uses.
They allege Lieber, who chairs Harvard's chemistry department, lied about his connection to the Chinese government, concealing a contract that paid him $50,000 a month and more than $150,000 in personal living expenses, all to set up a joint research lab with China's Wuhan University, unbeknownst to Harvard, through what's called the 1,000 Talents Plan, a program China created to bring U.S. researchers overseas, but what prosecutors say has been used as a ploy in the past to steal information.
This is a small sample of China's ongoing campaign to siphon off American technology and know-how for Chinese gain.
And efforts to crack down on this also led to the arrest of a researcher at Beth Israel Hospital. And now the search for this woman, a Chinese national conducting research at BU, who they've alleged was doing work here for the Chinese military and is suspected to already be back in China. Did you mislead Harvard? In Lieber's case, the accusations center solely on making false statements, though, allegedly misleading the Department of Defense, which supported him through grants, and Harvard itself, where he's worked for nearly 2 decades.
Now, Lieber is currently on paid leave from Harvard. Both he and his wife had to surrender their passports today, and he cannot leave the state while he's out on bail. We're live in Boston. I'm Caroline Conley, NBC 10 Boston.